Welcome to PPI Conversations, an opportunity to connect with leading edge thinkers and leaders and discuss today's pressing topics in the engineering and construction industry. With your host, PPI Executive Director Gary Fischer. We at PPI address the root cause of major capital project cost and schedule overruns through the research and dissemination of project production management and its foundation of operations science. Enjoy the conversation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another what's going to be a really interesting PPI conversation. One recent study revealed that between now and 2060, the world's population will be doubling, and just the amount of building floor space required to meet that demand will be equivalent to building the entire city of New York every month for the next 40 years. Just stop and think about that for a minute. Layer on top of that, the global concern with climate change has catalyzed many countries to set ambitious carbon emission reduction goals. And it's interesting to note that embodied carbon and all that infrastructure will be responsible for almost half the total new construction emissions between now and 2050. So there's going to be great pressure to manage embedded carbon emissions and all that infrastructure. Now layer on top of that, all the move towards electrification as the primary energy source, displacing hydrocarbons and meeting the infrastructure demands of the digital economy. Altogether, this is creating enormous challenges and strains on the construction industry and all the industries and suppliers of equipment and materials that support it. And it's clear to us here at the Industry Production Institute that to have any chance of meeting these challenges, real change is required. Improved productivity in the construction industry is not optional. And one of the most significant barriers to that change is galvanizing people to embrace and adopt new ways of thinking and doing work. And why is that so difficult for humans to do? With that question in mind, we're privileged to get some time with Anil Seth, who's one of the top neuroscientists in the world. He's going to help us get inside the mind and why we as humans do what we do and what we can do to influence change. So Anil, let's get started. Thank you so much for devoting some of your time with us today. First off, let's start by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do.
Oh, thanks, Gary. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to talk to you folk at the Institute as well. As you said very kindly, I'm a neuroscientist, so I'm fundamentally interested in the brain, how the brain works. I'm a university professor. I've trod the academic path through my career, and I started out as a kid interested in one question, which was consciousness. We have this complicated machine inside our skulls, and it does stuff. It moves our body around. It helps us survive. But there's something wonderful that it does too, which is accompanying all this whirring and neural circuitry. We have experiences. We open our eyes and it feels like something to see the world, and it feels like something to be a person in the world. When we make decisions, it feels like something to choose to do one thing rather than another thing. People often call this the free will. We feel like we've got free will over our actions. How does this happen? How does this massive wetware inside our skull generate conscious experiences? So this is not a new question, of course. This has fascinated and frustrated philosophers and scientists and people from religious backgrounds as well. It's fascinated people for thousands of years. So I don't think we're going to solve it now, but neuroscience has made a lot of progress. This is a very exciting time to be in neuroscience, addressing questions like this that are no longer solely the realm of philosophy and religion. They're also questions that science, whether it's psychology, neuroscience, physics, computer science, has something to say about. So my trajectory has been, I started off doing physics and computer science for a PhD in artificial intelligence, and then moved into neuroscience. And for the last 15, nearly 20 years now, I've been running a lab at Sussex University on the south coast of England, bringing together lots of different disciplines to try and shed light on these fundamental questions of consciousness, and also try to explore the implications of the progress we're making for different parts of society, for medicine, for technology, and perhaps also in this context too.
Interesting. So you said you got interested in this as a youngster?
Well, yeah, I mean, so I think, and I'm going to ask you this next question then, because I have a suspicion that pretty much all of us at some point in our lives, we all have this realization about, like, hold on a minute, why am I me and not someone else?
Yeah.
What's going to happen when I die? Where was I before I was born? And usually we have these questions, and our parents tell us to shut up and eat our dinner. And the education system certainly doesn't encourage questions like this. It tends to educate us out of this kind of curiosity. But I think, I speak to a lot of kids as well at schools, and the level of interest in these basic questions is huge. And a concern for some of the things you mentioned in your introduction, of course, like the impact of climate change, the rapid acceleration of technological change. And this is something that the next generation is going to have to deal with.
That's true. Well, that's very interesting. So let's kind of jump right into the topic. And maybe this is not a good question, but let's start with it. You could redirect me if it's not a good question. Why do we make the choices we make?
Well, so really, you should have got a therapist on rather than a neuroscientist to answer a question like that. It's very personal, right? I struggle as much as anyone. I struggle with the decisions that I'm faced with in both in my personal life and in professional life. I mean, decisions are hard, but I think it is interesting. There is a very interesting neuroscience perspective on how we make decisions in general that can frame whatever context we're facing when we've got to do something specific. And this context is a challenge to an idea that many of us have inherited primarily through the Western culture we're in, which is that we have these rational souls, if you like, that are perched inside our skull. We take in information from the world, we read out the world through our senses, we think about it. There's a little computer inside our skull that figures out, okay, here's the world, what's the best thing to do, and we rationally come to the conclusion, and then we do it. In the old style of AI, we sense, we think, and we act.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is kind of wrong in almost every way. Right. And I think by continuing to think of decision making in this sort of linear sequence of sense, think, act, I think we mislead ourselves about how we make decisions, the factors that affect our decision making, and, to be honest, how much control we have over this in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Wow,
so
keep going. You're on a great train.
We can ask, why is this picture wrong? Well, the first way it's wrong is that when we perceive the world, when we sense the world, we're not just reading out what's there as if the senses are transparent windows onto this objective reality. Yeah. It seems like that. When I open my eyes in the morning, it seems as though I'm seeing the world as it really is, unless I'm not wearing my glasses or something like that. But if I've got my glasses or contacts in, it seems as though the world is just as it is, and I perceive it. Now, this is not what's happening. The world exists, of course, it's out there, but the way we experience it is always a construction of the brain. The brain is making sense of this ambiguous and noisy information that's coming in through the eyes and the ears. Now, there's no such thing as color out there in the world. Our brain makes up color from colorless wavelengths of light. Mm-hmm. And so this illusion that we see things as they really are is just very misleading. The novelist Anil said it very well. We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. And that's, I think, goes very deep. It's color, but it's basically everything. And this means that different people will experience the world in different ways. And maybe we'll talk about the project trying to measure this, called the perception census, which I'd love people to take part in, but because we don't know very much about it. But it's certainly true that we do all experience the world differently. So if we perceive the world in a way that's very dependent on us, then the first thing is we're not perceiving it objectively in a way that we might think we are, in order to make the best decisions. The decisions we're going to make are already biased by how we perceive the current situation. And that can be as simple as looking at a shadow on a surface or it could be much more abstract, like what is going well, what is working in this situation, what is not working. And if you're thinking about a situation in an industry or in a society, then just understanding that different people can literally see the same thing differently is, I think, a useful recognition when you're trying to manage a change. So that's the first thing that's wrong. The second thing that's wrong about this sense, think, act is that action is part of sensation. Like we perceive the world partly through behaving within it. Our eyes are moving thousands of times a day, probably tens of thousands. We barely notice that, right? And that everything that we do is tightly coupled to action. It's this continuous loop. We don't just pause and then make a decision. And yeah, I think this is important as well, because it just means that we don't ever really inhabit this middle ground where we can sort of figure out, okay, that's the way the world is. What's the decision? Do it. There's this continuous feedback. And the third way it's wrong is this think bit in the middle. We are not rational cognitive computers that figure out the optimal thing to do. Our decisions are driven by emotional bias. This has been long known. The philosopher Descartes is most responsible for thinking that we are these like rational souls. But most of the history of psychology has shown us that without emotions, it's not only that we make bad decisions, we're barely able to make decisions at all. People without a little
more, can you give me an example of what that would look like?
Well, there are people who have a lot of the evidence comes from brain damage, where the situation is more extreme. But in people with certain forms of brain damage who have an emotional flattening, they start making very poor life decisions generally. And it's as if the emotional element provides a kind of common currency to figure out how to do things. If you think about the problem we face in daily life, it's impossibly complex. Computers would be very bad at it. Should I talk to you, or go and make dinner, or write a paper, or call my mother, or something? How do you weigh up these different options? Or look at my pension. There's so many important things that unfold over different timescales that involve totally different contexts, that it's a wonder we do anything at all. And emotion is the thing that kind of structures our mental lives so that we act. It's an impetus to act, but it's not it's not, by definition, it's usually not a very rational thing. It's biased in one way or the other way. But it's important. I think we need to just recognize the influence that emotion has on decision making, rather than try and get rid of it. And then the last thing I'm going to say is just sometimes we are not even aware of the choices that we do make, which is where it gets really.
Tell me more about that.
So there's this fascinating phenomenon called choice blindness in psychology, and again, it's an experiment, so it's pushed it to the extreme. The interest for me is like how much of this is going on all the time. So in choice blindness, it was a Swedish researcher called Peter Johansson. This was from quite a while ago, and what he did was he had this study where he gave people a repeated choice, and this choice was quite simple. It was a bit ethically dubious because these are the psycho. Anyway, he gave male students repeated choices between two photos of females, and he would ask them which they found most attractive. And so they would pick a face, and then they would get another choice, and so on and so on and so on. And occasionally, he would also ask them after each one, why did you make that choice? Do you prefer blonde people, or was it the smile, or what was it just something, right? So you do this again and again, and then occasionally what he would do is he would swap the cards. So he did this with real cards, and so it's a little bit of close-up magic. He would give the person the card they did not choose. And he would ask them, he would show them, he's not hiding it, he would show them the card that they did not choose a second or two before, and say, So why did you prefer this person? And most of the time, they would not notice that they were being presented with the face they didn't choose, and B, they would still come up with a reason why they chose the option that they in fact did not choose.
Wow.
I find this is quite remarkable. And I think it gets to it just deconstructs this idea that we're these little computers in the brain. The brain is always just like, it's playing catch up. It sometimes confabulates. It just tries to make sense of what's going on. And if it sees the face, like, oh, it's coming up with a story that, yeah, that's the reason I chose that face. Maybe somewhere there's a recognition that I didn't do that. But I think that any choice we make is incredibly complicated, is extended over time. It may look different after the event than before the event.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to get off on a rabbit trail, but when you said there was no, I'm still back on, you said there was no color and it's just our perception. But how in the world do we ever agree that green is green or that orange is orange? If we're all perceiving it, from our own, brains.
Well, I'm glad you come back to this, actually. I mean, this is a very old philosophical thought experiment. It's called the inverted spectrum, and it's exactly this idea. If the green that I see when I see like a freshly mown lawn, it could be the same inner experience that you have when you look at a blue sky, but you just say green. How would we ever know?
Yeah.
How would we ever know? You could have a very different experience, but we use the same language and it occurs in the same situation. It could be very different. I actually think this is probably not the case, because if you take that thought experiment further and you say something like, could you be experiencing pain when I experience pleasure, but we call it different, we use the same word? I don't think you would swap those, because it would affect us very differently. So I think it's actually true. But what is true is that we may well see slightly different shit. We may well have different experiences. Mm-hmm. And here's the thing. If the differences are not very big, we will never know. They don't surface into different words, into different behaviors. When they get big enough, we do notice, and then we sort of attach labels and say, oh, this person has ADHD, or this person has color blindness, or this person has something else. But my suspicion is, in the kind of normal range where we all think we see the world as it is, I think there's a lot of difference, that we're more different on the inside than we think we are. Yeah. Because we can see externally. I mean, we're getting used to the importance of externally visible diversity. I mean, you and I are different skin colors, we have different accents, we're probably different heights. It's hard to tell on Zoom. Doesn't really, they're easy to see, and we can make of them what we will. But differences on the inside, we just can't see. So I actually have this project with colleagues in Glasgow called the Perception Census, where we're trying to measure this for the first time. We're trying to actually map out this hidden perceptual inner diversity, understanding just the landscape of how different we are on the inside, because very little is known about it. I'm just pretty sure it exists, but we're for the first time trying to figure it out. So it'd be amazing to get people to take part. It's very, very easy. It's just an online set of little illusions and experiments. All you need is your own computer, and you can help the research. But taking part, I think, also will help people learn about their own particular way of perceiving the world, and then begin to understand that the way any particular person experiences the world is their own way, and it's not necessarily the same as somebody else's. And I think that recognition can be really quite powerful. Yeah,
I got partway through that survey, and
great.
I kept wondering, well, what are you trying to accomplish with this? Now we understand. That's really interesting, and I look forward to hearing the results of that. How long is that survey going to run? And
so, thank you. We're collecting data until the end of the calendar year, and then it's going to take us. We'll probably try and release some headline results very quickly, but it's going to take us a long time to dig into it and figure out what riches are really buried there. But yeah, thank you for taking part, and yeah, anybody else who wants to, I mean, it would be really appreciated.
And we'll put up right at the end of this conversation the web address. So when people, I would recommend everybody take it. It's just taking it is is fascinating. Yeah, very well done. It's going to be very interesting. So let's cycle back and talk about why change is so difficult for humans.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is tough. And there's no magic solution to this from neuroscience. I think there's just different perspectives on it. Change is tough. So here's one reason why change is tough. It's a bit related to that choice blindness that we were talking about. It's sometimes we don't even see change when it's there. So this is another quirk of how we perceive things. Again, it sort of undermines the notion that we see things as they are. Embedded in that assumption is that, well, if things change, then our perception will also change. But it's been very convincingly demonstrated that this isn't true. That if things, for instance, change very slowly, then our perception of the thing will change. So let's imagine, I'll give you an example to ground it. So coloring. Let's say our Zoom backgrounds was slowly changing color. Then maybe we can fix this in post-production edit.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Although we'd have to have done it before, because now I'm describing it.
Now they're already going to know. Okay.
So if you're going to fix it earlier. So the background slowly changed color, and we're not paying attention to the background, and probably it's a smaller part of the screen than it is. We may not perceive the change at all. So our perception will change. We'll start off by looking at white, and we'll end up looking at whatever color it is, and we'll perceive the color that's there. But our perception of change will be absent. This is called change blindness, and it underlines that change of perception is not the same thing as perception of change. So we don't always see things when they change, and of course that will also differ between people, or that's at least my hypothesis. So if we're trying to address change, manage change, create change, recognize change, we're already up against the fact that our perception of what change is going on is full of holes. And we see it, for instance, in climate change. This is a big deal. Things change slowly, so we don't perceive the change. We only sort of perceive it in terms of like, oh, more big storms now. So that's a sign, because we can perceive kind of frequency of big storms. But baseline changes in climate are too slow for us to perceive anything as actually changing. And there may be many other contexts where that's the case. So that's one thing why I think change is psychologically challenging, just noticing it, recognizing it. And the other thing is, I think we underestimate the importance of habit. We're really creatures of habit. And the world is very complex. To behave in the world, we rely on routines, whether they're behavioral routines, getting up in the morning, going what you do in the bathroom, and you make it to the larger structures of life. I mean, we rely on routine, I think, much more than we realize that we do. And these routines are also, perception is a bit of a habit as well. We get used to perceiving the world in a particular way. So the question is, how do we revise these habits? How do we change them? And no magic potion here either, but simply recognizing their existence, I think, is a powerful first step.
It is. Seems like that, tell me if I'm wrong, as I may be, that you first got to perceive the need to change before any change in those habits can occur.
Yeah, I think you might be right about that. For sort of motivating actual behavioral change, yes, you need to frame it in a way that the need is very clear. And I think this has been a massive challenge in many areas of society, right? Just making the need salient enough, not punting it down to some unknown future. It's far too easy to push these things off, because into the future, because people forget the future is actually not that far away. I mean, there was a thing I remember hearing, of course, in much of the world and certainly in the UK, there's an energy supply crisis at the moment.
Yeah, right.
And this quote had gone around from, I believe it was Nick Clegg or David Cameron. There was the UK government about 10 years ago were discussing whether to invest in new nuclear power stations.
Mm.
And the quote was from 2011 that, there's no point doing that because it's going to take 10 years before we get any benefit from it. And it's like, look at that, 10 years, that went by quite quickly.
Great.
Wouldn't it be nice to have a few more
ample electricity at this point in time? Yeah, exactly.
That just very explicit discounting of the future. This is again, this is a common psychological handicap I think a lot of human beings have. Our timescales psychologically are much shorter than we rationally know. 10 years.
Kind of like, are we talking weeks, months, years, or what's that?
Well, I don't know. I think it depends on the context, but there's all sorts of studies in things like behavioral economics when you can show that how much more money would people need at a point in the future to defer having a certain amount of money now, or the other way around. How much would you lose, etc. And you can measure the amount you discount that time, and it's pretty scary, the extent to which we do it, even when we know the future is coming, and even when we know we'll still be here or our children will be here. We can't help it. And I think that this is one of those ideas that has many levels, and I always like to bring it back to color, and we've discussed color as well. Like the fact that we now know, both of us, we've already discussed that colors don't actually exist out there in the world. They're a collaboration between the brain and the world.
Right.
The artist Cezanne said it best. He said, "Color is where the brain and the universe meet," which I love. Right.
Interesting.
But of course, knowing that doesn't prevent me from seeing color. I open my eyes and I still see the same colors that I always saw. So in the same way, it's kind of not enough to just to know that these things are going on, because that itself won't change the experience. Knowing change blindness happens doesn't sort of immunize me against that psychological issue. Knowing that future discounting is a thing doesn't change my experience of it. It will still feel like the 10 years in the future doesn't have the significance that it should. So this is the really tricky thing to solve. How do we translate knowledge of these things into something that actually makes us make decisions bearing these things in mind?
I mean, I heard you say once, it's not I believe it when I see it, but instead it's I'll see it when I believe it. That, I guess you're getting at that, the habit, or the what we hold is already true in our mind somehow. So go explain that a little bit more. I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, that's kind of a nice way to summarize this core idea that we say I'll believe it when I see it, as this sort of crystallization of the common sense, naive. It's just common sense way of how the brain works. Like, I see something, therefore it is, therefore I will now believe that thing to be true. And if I see the ball cross the line, I believe a goal has been scored. But to put it the other way around and to say I'll see it when I believe it is actually, I think, more true to what's going on in the brain. And it emphasizes that what we experience, even though it seems to be a direct readout of the world, is coming from the inside out, from the top down. What we experience is what the brain believes to be going on. Now, this doesn't mean that I, as a person, like I, Anil, sort of have to explicitly think, oh yeah, I believe the sky is blue, and then I'll see a blue sky.
Yeah.
In that case, it's my visual cortex is basically believing that the sky is blue, and so I will then see a blue sky. So these beliefs are what we might call that they can be unconscious. They don't have to be these things we explicitly think. but they're nonetheless coming from the top down and the inside out. And so that's why I think there's some truth to this. Of course, it's not arbitrary. It's not that we just, whatever we experience is completely made up by the brain and nothing to do with the world. It's that the brain's beliefs are always being calibrated by the sensory signal. So the sensory information that comes into the brain isn't just read out and transformed into the world. It's there to keep the brain's beliefs or predictions geared to the world. But and here's the key, not in ways that are constrained by accuracy. Accuracy is not the goal of the brain. The goal of the brain is not to see the world most accurately. It's to see it as is useful for us as these living organisms with bodies and lifespans of a few decades and whatever. Evolution has tuned our brains to see things as it's useful, and that to some extent coincides with accuracy. Like if a big rock is hurtling towards me, I need to perceive that.
You want accuracy.
You want accuracy, but there are many ways in which it can depart from accuracy. So all these examples of things like future discounting, change blindness, even color itself. Color it can't be accurate because it doesn't actually exist objectively out there anyway. But it's very, very useful for us to experience things in color.
So this presents a real challenge or conundrum and how to change somebody's belief about something so they'll see it differently. You got any advice for us on how to do that? Those of us who are trying to promote change, fundamental change in our industry?
Well, I think, it's so, firstly, I do think it's probably impossible to actually change very much what people see. To be more literal again, it's back to this idea that even if I know that colors don't exist in the world, I will still see them. So all I can do, the best I can do is change my relationship to the experiences that I have and basically have another level. So, and I do this in my everyday life. I walk around thinking about what I'm experiencing, continuing to experience it, but also thinking about the way in which it's built, the way in which it might be accurate or inaccurate. And this just adds another level. And I think building in that other level of reflection on just questioning, like, what is it about the situation that is really going on, and what about the situation is me bringing my own brain's beliefs, predictions, desires to the situation. Won't change what you experience, but it can change how you react and respond to that experience. So I think that's one take home for me. It's almost like a sort of perceptual meditation. You're just always trying to automate this practice of reflecting on, like, what am I experiencing, and I should not take it for granted that what I'm experiencing is the way it is. Whether it's the color of the grass or the situation of building a new pipeline or factory or something.
Well, so I've had this conversation multiple times with various project leaders, and it plays out one of two ways. And we talk about what the approach that they're taking based on traditional methods, and we have an honest conversation about it. And it goes something like, well, that's probably not going to turn out any different than the past 100 projects before you. Yeah, but I'm going to try really hard to make it different this time. I said, well, but it probably is not going to turn out any different than all the 100 projects before you. Yeah, I know, but I'm just going to do my best. Well, why wouldn't you be willing to try this different approach? It couldn't be any worse than what you're probably going to experience. But then I get one or two responses. Oh, that's a good point. I never thought about it that way. Or no, that's too risky. So I don't help. If you could peel that back for me somehow. And what do I do about that situation? Somebody doesn't want to take the risk to try something different with the opportunity to be better versus staying something that they're tried and true, but they know really won't work.
And is it really risky? I mean, I guess that's the thing. If there is, a big risk there, then that might be reasonable to not try something new.
Or it's a perceived risk. For me, it's not a perceived risk at all, because hey, it can't be any worse than what they're already doing. I view my personal view is that current method is far more risky,
Right.
because it almost has a certain poor outcome. So why not? Let's, like one guy I talked to, he said, yeah, it can't possibly be any worse than what we're already doing. And but that's rare. That's probably 1 in 50
Okay.
have that response.
Interesting. So I think this, it might be used. So from the perspective of what we've been talking about here, like one key thing does seem to be risk. And again, you could be facing the same situation, like you continue to do A, or you switch to your new method B.
Yeah.
And you've got a particular perspective on the risks involved, which strongly favor switching. Yeah. And you can see the risk, and maybe there's evidence that supports your evaluation of that risk.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're facing is somebody else looking at perhaps the same evidence who comes to a very different conclusion about risk. I mean, they perceive risk in a very different way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a bit like, again, you're looking at two people looking at a lawn. Are they seeing the same color? It's easy to assume that you're looking at the same thing, so therefore the person is seeing the same thing. But they may not be. They may be looking at the same data, the same thing, but actually having a very, very different perception of the risk. Why? Well, because they may be bringing different prior beliefs, prior expectations to it. So I think the question then becomes, how do you align? Like, it seems if you both experience the risk in the same way, then it would be a much easier decision to make.
Leap. Yeah.
Right.
That's a very good point.
How do you then align so that I think you then want to understand, and I'm honestly, I'm making this up off the top of my head now, but you want to understand what is it that's shaping this person's perception of risk that makes it different from yours?
So drill into the risk perception deeper before trying to jump to the alternative.
Well, I think so, because I'm sure you've done a great job of laying out the evidence, right?
Yeah.
And the question is, that doesn't seem to be working. Like, so why isn't it? So they're obviously interpreting the evidence in a different way. Mm-hmm. And it's trying to understand why and how that is the case. And one lens to look at that through is the lens of risk, because I think that seems to be key to this particular situation.
Is there any particular thing that opens the brain up to acceptance of new ideas or different ways of looking at it? Are there events? Are the things that do that to us?
Well, yeah, not many legal things.
No, legal things.
There are plenty of things you can do.
Well, I've personally experienced having cancer, and that opened up my mind to the importance of a lot of other things that I'd kind of taken for granted, family and my health and things like that. It was kind of a shock to my brain, and it just helped me see things in a different way. Is that a common phenomenon? And is that?
I think, yeah. I mean, I think it is, and I'm sorry to hear you went through that, but I think that's not uncommon to respond to these. I mean, lots of people in the pandemic have had similar reappraisals of what's important in their life, and like how am I going to go back to that job that involved commuting 2 hours a day? And there's so much change in people's perspectives that have opened them up. And again, I think it's because it was very disruptive, right? There was a disruption to routine coupled with quite an existential challenge to many people. At the beginning of the pandemic, people were really scared. And this is not a recommendation to make people really scared and disrupt their routines totally. But certainly when that happened, this is one of the things we see. And this is why we see this in cases of very severe illness as well. Mm-hmm. And are there other ways? Well, it gets really tricky, because obviously you don't want to give people a crisis to then open them to new ways. It has to be continuous with their existence as it is. Sure. And that's tough, because then you're always fighting against the status quo. And I do think it comes down to this. People can be very responsive to reasons but you've got to provide the right context for that, and it's getting under the trying to get under their habits and reveal them for what they are, that we don't always see the world the same way, that we might perceive more abstract things like risk and future discounting in different ways. These are, again, not magic bullets, but they may have. Beyond that, I don't know. I don't know how you change people's minds in a reliable way. And of course, there are going to be individual differences here as well. Just as there are differences in how we see the world. I mean, we all know this from our personal lives, right? Some people are, by their deeply ingrained in their personality, very resistant to change, which is fine in some situations and less fine in others, and vice versa.
Yeah, boy, that's a lot of good food for thought there. I like getting down into the habits, the right context, thinking more deeply about the risk. We probably shortcut the conversations in that space. As I'm just reflecting here on my conversations with folks, we may need to I might try spending more time in that space, realizing that we don't all see green as green, or we're guessing what green is. We're guessing what risk is.
Yeah, it may seem like a frivolous thing to do, but I found it can work. You give people these simple demonstrations of simple exercises, in perception, and then you just that reveals a point you can then generalize. You can then use that as a spur to go and think, well, if you can be wrong about that, or if you can be mistaken about that, then what else is taken for granted?
Maybe there's some other ways you could be wrong in your perceptions. I like that. I have not thought about using one of those perception exercises in the course of that conversation to kind of open the brain to, well, maybe there is a other possibility.
Yeah.
That's a cool idea. Yeah. So you wrote a book titled Being You.
I did.
Partway through that book too. So what was your motivation in writing that book, and what were you trying to
it was, I've been working in this area of consciousness for 20 plus years now, and it was just time. It felt like time. I talk about these ideas a lot in public. I've given TED Talks, all these sorts of things. But it just came to the point a few years ago when I thought, I need to get it all down in one place and write it in a way that hopefully everybody, or at least most people, can understand, not just neuroscientists, but the general interested public. And I partly was doing it for myself, just to figure out how it all fits together for me.
Yeah.
And how the different parts all added up. Because in my job as a lab head, we do one experiment, we do another experiment, and you write that up, and you write that up, and you write a bit of theory, and they're all these little bits, and they all seem to hang together, but it's not quite clear how. So I wanted to write this book to bring everything together, and because I thought there was something new to say. People are interested in these issues.
Sure.
Everyone's interested in themselves, right? We know this.
Right.
What are people? They're interested in themselves. So if you can, tell them something about themselves that they didn't previously know, I think you're going to do some useful work. And that's what the book tries to do. It takes this whole science of consciousness and tries to bring it together in a way that's relevant, personally relevant to each of us. So I talk about, some of my own personal experiences as well. That's the great thing about study of consciousness. It's a big scientific mystery, but it's also a deeply personal adventure for each of us. So trying to look at consciousness through the lens of what it might mean in each of our lives, with this understanding of the brain and of the mind and the body. And I came to some sort of interesting places that I hadn't expected to come to. So one place I come to in the book is this recognition that our experiences, our conscious experiences of the world and of being a self, are really very, very closely tied to our living bodies. We tend to look at our bodies as these kind of meat robots that deteriorate over time and mainly take us from meeting to meeting. But we forget that the reason we have brains in the first place is to keep our bodies alive.
Right.
And it's not to solve complex problems or even do crosswords or even speak. It's to regulate and keep the heart beating, keep the blood oxygenated. That's why any animal has a brain.
Right.
And that kind of changes the perspective on everything. And we start to understand that there's a fundamental bias in all our perception, back to perceiving the world again, which is that we perceive the world in the way that evolution has decided is most likely to keep the body going, keep the body alive. And that's true of emotion, that's true of mood, but that's also true of how we experience free will, how we experience being a self in the world, and how we experience the other people too. And this makes it very challenging to imagine things like, there's a lot of hype in artificial intelligence at the moment that computers are about to become aware and conscious. And this is just, for me, this is nonsense. We are living machines, and our nature as conscious beings is deeply tied to our flesh and blood heritage. And this, for me, is a very reassuring picture, because a lot of science, actually, in trying to, fundamentally, we're trying to understand our place in nature, our place in the universe. And the history of science has always shown us to be rather less special and exceptional than we previously thought. Right? We're not at the center of the universe. We're in some distant part of it. But is this disappointing? Of course not. The universe is so much bigger and grander than people imagined before Copernicus. Right. It's awesome, literally awesome. And then Darwin comes along and says, we're not special. We're related to all other animals, all other living creatures. We have common ancestors. Is this disappointing? Of course not. It shows the tree of life to be much deeper and richer than we imagined from sort of pre-evolutionary texts. And now we come to consciousness, and we still have this idea from Descartes that we have this rational soul that might survive the body and move on, and is somehow that's what now sets us apart from the rest of the natural world. And I think, and I try and sort of lay this out in the book, this is also not true. And our conscious minds, our conscious lives are as much part of nature as anything else. And this is how it should be. We should see all aspects of our lives in just continuous with the rest of nature and not set apart from it. And for me, this is a very kind of reassuring, heartening, grounding message that comes out just from asking these basic questions about how do brains do what they do, and why do they generate the experience of being a person.
So are you saying that AI could never replace the human brain?
Well, it depends what you mean by replace. It's moving fast. My PhD was in AI 20 odd years ago, and seeing how it's developed is fascinating and scary, right? So if we think about decision making, there's a big challenge with AI now. AI systems are increasingly making decisions, whether it's in medical diagnosis or in driving a car, various situations. People are devolving decision making to algorithms. The issue is that they're often not very transparent. We don't know why they make the decisions they make. And they may demonstrably perform better, but then perhaps when the context changes, they may do a lot worse. And if we don't know why they make the decisions they make, that's going to be very difficult for us to deal with. And we also don't know the biases we're building in to our systems. So there's a lot going on there. So I think that technologies like AI, we've inherited this trope from science fiction that we often think about it as replacing us. And that's what true AI will be. It will be a humanoid Gary or a humanoid Anil that will basically do what we do, but you'll just plug it in the evening and you won't have to sleep or eat. But science and technology don't usually work that way. Where it works best is when we stop with this hubristic notion of just generating artificial versions of ourselves with us as gods, and say, well, what's the most useful tool? How do we complement the human mind? And we do this with computers, with calculators, with cars. I mean, we already have plenty of machines that are not in competition with us. They complement us. And I think AI, the best perspective on AI will be the same, that we build complementary tools, not mimics of ourselves.
Interesting. That's a really good way to look at it. That resonates really well with me. That makes a lot of sense. So I respectfully of your time here, can you kind of, rather than me summing it up, can you sum up, in just a short package here, what we've talked about in terms of advice to those of us who are trying to elicit change in other human beings?
All right. Well, that's a tough one. Thank you for landing me with that right at the end. So I think the key message that we've been talking about, from a humble perspective of a neuroscientist, is that how things seem is rarely how they are in the way we experience the world and in the choices we make. Even though it seems different, right? It seems as though we see the world as it is. It seems as though we take in the information, we make the decision, we chung it through these rational processes in our mind, and we struggle, and then eventually we decide. What's going on under the hood is probably not like that at all. What we see is a construction that comes from the inside out just as much as from the outside in.
Mm-hmm.
What we do is intimately tied up with what we perceive, often without any intermediate stage of decision making. And when we do make decisions, we may not be aware of the influences that affect our decisions, and we may not even remember the decisions that we did make.
Good
as
point.
This choice kind of thing shows. So what do? Well, I think we just try and foster in ourselves a bit of modesty and humility about all of these things, how we perceive things, what we do. Recognize that other people may experience the same situation very differently. Try to understand what the relevant dimensions are, whether it's color or whether it's risk or whether it's future. And not assume that they see things the same way because that's how you see things. I think that all of these things together, they don't provide a magic recipe, but they can help expose the issues, help expose the problem, help expose the way in which we deal with the problem. And then I think it's up to everybody involved to bring their own autonomy and ideas to the table. And what you do with that recognition, of course, that's a different question. And that's where it's back over to you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, man, that was a great wrap up. I really appreciate that. I think we're gonna have to write that one down and get it put in a prominent place on our website. That was really good advice. So thank you so much for your time, giving us freely of your all your years of study and wisdom and careful thought. A lot to think about in here. So thank you again for taking the time with us, and we really appreciate it.